So, without further ado, I'm going to start chapter 20. Chapter 20. This starts on page 539 in your textbook. Is it warm in here to you all, or just me? So, this morning I had a meeting with a bunch of business people at the Guilford Merchants Association. I remember one of the leads groups there. And one of my colleagues brought me the Wall Street Journal's mansion section. This article is called The War of the Mega Mansions. And this is talking about a mansion, let's see, dubbed the Billionaire, the 38,000 square foot Goliath by Bruce Makowski. This is in LA somewhere. Has 5 bars, a lazy river, and a candy wall. I don't even know what a candy wall would be, but it's listed for a mere $180 million. There's roughly $30 million worth of motorcycles and cars in the house. I guess they come with the house. I don't know. I've never sold a house with the cars included, especially if they're, worth $30 million on their own. Anyway, it's pretty interesting stuff. Some people just have too much money out there. I mean, really, $200 million for a house. And I suspect that mansion doesn't have any environmental issues, although you never know. So let's talk about this a little bit. A couple of things just to note when I put these PowerPoint slides together. I try to give you the page that in the textbook, if you're following along. Some of it goes very specifically to that page. Some of the things that I'll say, there isn't necessarily a page number that goes with it. But this is, of course, the learning objectives that are in each little section. So first of all, why should we care about environmental issues? I mean, this is a real estate class, right? It's not Environment 101. Why should we care about that? What do you think?
Your health.
For health reasons, okay? But again, I'm a real estate broker, right? I'm dealing with houses. What would I care about? Am I worried about my health?
Liability.
Liability, okay. So the health of somebody anyway, and the liability that might be involved. Anything else?
Material facts.
Material facts, yeah. Environmental issues are material facts, and we'll talk more about that later. So you all are absolutely right. The fact is that an environment that's healthy means that we have better health of our clients. And I'm going to say this over and over again. Real estate is a relationship business. I really am not in the business necessarily of selling houses, right? This is not like, I don't know, Walmart or something where people come in and decide on a house. I'm in the business of creating relationships with people. And because I have that relationship with people, I'm going to help them to kind of weave their way through the home buying process. And that consultation business is really what I do. And part of that is protecting their health, right? If I'm working with a seller, to make sure that they're aware of issues in their own home that may affect the sale of their home. If we're talking about a buyer, certainly we want to protect their future health living in the house. And of course, if somebody is living in a house that is environmentally hazardous, then it affects really their quality of life. In fact, this afternoon, I walked over to my across the street neighbor's house, and my neighbor was just looking really poorly. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "We got mold growing in our house." Now, this is not, a tiny little, house. It's a nice house, and we've had a lot of humidity in the house and so forth, but we talked about the fact that if your air conditioning system isn't taking the water out of the air effectively, you can have humidity, really building up in your house. And I think that's what was happening with their house. But they had some mold growing on the walls and in the bathrooms and so forth. So poor ventilation maybe, but she was really getting sick from it. And so it can happen to anybody, and so we have to be aware of the problems associated. And of course, a healthy home is going to have a higher value as well. It's going to have a much greater value. So when do people notice these issues most often? And, when do people notice asbestos and mold and things like that? When does it happen most often?
When they have symptoms.
What?
When they have symptoms or when they feel sick.
When they start feeling sick, okay, yeah, definitely then. But many times there are no symptoms, right? They don't notice it, or it's something that builds up over a very long time. The most common time when we notice these things is when the property is changing hands, when you're having inspections done on the house. I can't tell you how many houses I've been to, let's say an older person, they haven't been under their house for decades, and they had a drippy faucet or a drippy pipe or something under the house that's been dripping for 10 years, and they've got mold growing under the house. They hadn't noticed because they didn't go under their house, right? So when people start having home inspections and things like that, they're looking for radon and termites and all that sort of thing, that's when a lot of this stuff is discovered. And so we need to be informed as real estate brokers when we're dealing with clients, because this is the time when these things are going to come up. So environmental issues become health issues, as you mentioned, and that becomes a real estate issue because it affects the value of the properties and the health of the people buying and selling them. So the good news is you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to know everything there is to know about mold or about asbestos. You need to have a working knowledge so that you can protect people from it. And so I'm going to give you kind of an overview of it today, but I can tell you that I've been in business now since 2001, and I'm still learning stuff every day about environmental issues. So I just encourage you, first of all, to seek that knowledge. I'm going to give you a taste of it tonight, but over your career, and I'm assuming that every one of you is going to pass those exams, right? Right? And you're going to become real estate brokers. So you owe it to yourself to get as informed as possible about these things. So you must be aware of the environmental hazards and protect the public with that knowledge. So the known presence on a property of any of the environmental hazards covered in the course is a material fact. So if it's a material fact, what does that mean?
Disclose it.
Do we have to disclose it? Right. Whether it's a buyer or a seller or both, we have to disclose the material facts. Anyone that's involved in the buying and selling of that real estate. And so sometimes, maybe a seller will have some mold growing someplace, and or maybe they'll have mold growing under the house. And one day it's there and the next day it's not because they've wiped it all off or something. Does that mean that the mold's not going to grow in there anymore? No. And in fact, sometimes the efforts that people use to get rid of something like mold actually just makes it even worse. So I've had experts tell me that spraying diluted Clorox on stuff, the water that they diluted it with just become water that the mold can use to grow with. So even though you kill some of it off, it just grows back. So you have to be really careful, make sure that you've educated yourself about it. So let's just jump right in. The first one is asbestos. So asbestos, of course, this was used to cover pipes to insulate hot water heaters, floor tiles. A lot of older homes have some asbestos in it. Probably the most common place that you'll run into asbestos is in older houses with asbestos siding. And I'll show you some pictures in just a minute. And of course, asbestos was a great fire-resistant material, worked very well for building materials for a long time. The problem is that it breaks down over time, and it becomes airborne. And my next door neighbor, Jim, died of something called mesothelioma. He worked with asbestos when he was a 20-year-old, and it took 40 years before it killed him. But basically, the asbestos fibers get into the lungs and go to other organs as well, and cause cancer. So we've determined that they're dangerous. So asbestos insulation was built in 1978. Most asbestos as building materials went away after that, but the things that were built before that time still have it. And in fact, you'll find it, especially in older homes. If you ever go to Irving Park or Fisher Park or any of the older neighborhoods, you'll see lots of asbestos, tiles and various other places. The problem becomes not necessarily with the siding itself, but when it gets broken. So somebody runs a mower into the side of the house or something, just chips off a little bit on the side, it becomes friable, which just means that it becomes able to be airborne. Asbestos tile in the kitchen is fine, but when it starts to deteriorate and break apart, now the little fibers get into the air and it's friable. And so be sure that you remember that term, friable, able to be inhaled. So it gets into the tissues of the lungs. The mesothelial tissue is just this outside lining of the lungs, and it causes cancer. So you end up with cancer of the lungs. It's different than lung cancer, which is actually inside the lungs. This tends to be on the outside of it. So these are some of the ways that we see it most often in real estate. So that old kitchen tile, wrapped pipes, we'll see with this sort of messy looking wrap on it. And then the siding that is starting to deteriorate, maybe a few rocks or the lawnmowers bumped up against it and cracked off the edges of it. This little cartoon says, the facilities people tell me there's asbestos in the ceiling. They say don't need to worry about it unless it gets disturbed. They plan to disturb it today. So if you work someplace that has old ceiling tiles, you better make sure you're out of there when they start taking those ceiling tiles out. So it is very costly to deal with asbestos. You have to wear the hazmat suits and all that sort of thing, and respirators. So most of the time they don't remove the asbestos. Most of the time they cover it up, if possible. So you'll see older homes that have asbestos siding, but they put vinyl siding over it to keep it from becoming friable. They encapsulate, which means they seal it off so that it can't get out. And just to give you an example, these are asbestos roof tiles on a commercial setting. And what you see here is he's spraying kind of a plastic coating over it. And so once they've sprayed that plastic coating on it, locks the fibers in so that they don't become friable. This is a typical commercial use of encapsulation. If it's like pipe insulation, you might see plastic wrap around them to seal them off. I mentioned siding, sometimes they'll get covered up. So another hazard is lead-based paint. And lead-based paint is, of course, metal used in the pigment and drying agent in these oil-based paint prior to 1978. And they were good, long-lasting paints, but lead poisoning is actually an ancient thing. We know that the Roman Empire was said to have fallen not just because they were greedy and so forth, but also because all the richest people in Rome were drinking out of lead-lined cups. And so back then, lead probably was the biggest danger, they didn't know it, to the wealthy, but today lead is probably much more dangerous in poverty-stricken areas where they have plumbing or they have lead paint, old paint that's flaking and peeling, and it's not been taken care of. And so, so what we have is the dust from these old pipes, from the flaking lead paint, gets on the floor. Little children pick it up, they put stuff in their mouth, they put their hands in their mouth, and they end up collecting lead in their system. It's very, very destructive to the nervous system. And so it affects their brain development and so forth. And so it's really a invasive kind of thing. You have to be careful if you are out in the country somewhere where people were, out shooting, like they had a little shooting range outside the house or something, and lots of lead from the bullets ended up in the soil. That can contaminate the soil. Solder from the lead pipes, all of those kinds of things. So in 1978, they banned lead-based paint. And actually, even before that, lead-based paint started to get out of fashion, but not because people knew it was dangerous, but because water-based latex paints started coming out. And so they were much easier to clean your brushes with a latex paint than an oil-based paint. But you will find in homes built before 1978, you'll find that underneath layers and layers of paint will be lead-based paint. So the question is, what do you do about it? You have to disclose it if you're a seller and you know about it, but most sellers don't know anything about the lead in their walls. They just don't. And so what I tell both buyers and sellers is, if it was built before 1978, you have to assume that you have some lead underneath that paint somewhere. And you have to treat it accordingly. So if it's painted, you want to keep it painted. If you're gonna renovate or you're gonna tear out walls or anything, you better make sure that you've got people doing it that know how to deal with lead and can protect themselves and you and your future environment as they take that all out. And they produced in 1992 a disclosure which allows us to disclose to buyers whether we know of any lead hazards. And so, let's see, in your textbook on page 544, you can see what that lead-based paint hazard addendum. Look on page 544 in your textbook. First of all, I want you to notice this big lead warning statement, which is boxed in to make sure that buyers really understand the hazards of lead. And under that, it says seller's disclosure. So the seller has to initial one of these boxes. It says the presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards, check one below. Known lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards are present in the housing. So if they know that there's lead paint, which means they've done testing in some form or fashion, then they have to disclose that. But most sellers are going to check the next box, which says seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards in the housing. The next one refers to reports. So records or reports available to the seller. The seller has provided the buyer with available records or reports. Most sellers don't have any records or reports regarding lead, unless they've had some significant work done to the house that required lead testing. But 99% of the time, they're going to check that second box, which says seller has no reports. And then the buyer has to initial that they've received copies of all the information listed above. They've received a pamphlet called Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, and that they've received the opportunity during the due diligence period to conduct a risk assessment. So they can actually test for lead. They have a 10-day period to do that. Or they can waive that assessment, which a lot of people do. They figure, well, there's probably lead in the walls. I know that there's probably lead in the walls. I'm just going to make sure that I keep it painted, keep it taken care of, and so forth. I want you to notice in most of the forms that are between the buyer and the seller, the agents have nothing to do with it. But I want you to notice here on the second page, first of all, the seller's agent has to initial where it says agent's acknowledgement. The agent has informed the seller of the seller's obligations. So you are signifying that you have told the seller what his obligations are involving lead disclosure, and make sure that they're in compliance. And then the signature section of this, you've got the buyers, you've got the sellers, but you've also got the buyer's agent and the seller's agent. So they're really making sure that everybody is aware of all this, that we've taken every opportunity we could to protect the public by disclosing this lead-based paint hazards. So remember that, because there's very few times when actually agents are involved in signing documents between the buyer and the seller. This is one exception to that. All right. So basically, the target housing are homes built prior to 1978. We have to give them to both buyers and renters. So somebody that's renting should get this lead-based paint hazard addendum as well. As I mentioned, the 10-day risk assessment is available, but they can waive it if they want to. And make sure everybody is aware. And the brokers are responsible for disclosure, but there is an exception to that. And that is, brokers are responsible for disclosure except a buyer's agent who is paid entirely by the buyer is exempt from disclosing the lead-based paint to the buyer. Let's think about that for a minute. Where does the commission for most buyer's agents come from? From the seller, right? The seller is paying a commission to his agent, which includes both the buyer side and the seller side. So the listing side and the buyer side. So most buyer's agents are paid through the seller. They are responsible for lead-based paint disclosure. But every once in a while, you have a situation where the buyer's agent is paid entirely by the buyer. What would be an example of that? When would a buyer get paid, or rather a buyer's agent get paid by their buyer entirely?
The listing agent does not agree to pay out of theirs if they cannot afford it.
Okay, so the listing agent doesn't offer any commission to the buyer's agent. That's a very unusual situation, by the way. But I suppose it's possible, and in fact it happened to me once that I was working with buyers. And when I looked up in the MLS how much the listing agent was offering to buyer's agents to sell his house, he had offered 0% commission. So we'll talk about that later. But the most common time when a buyer has to pay their own agent is with a for sale by owner. Okay, so for sale by owner says, I ain't paying no agents. So the buyer is responsible for that. So this is one of those tricky things that, they throw in there just to fool you on the testing. So there is no requirement to test for lead. That's important to note. Sellers don't have to test. Buyers don't have to test for lead. But if there are known hazards, they have to disclose it. And if you have lead in your house, again, we just want to make sure that it's encapsulated in some way, that it's kept covered, painted, so forth. And if we have contractors doing work, they need to be certified, and if you've got lead removal that needs to happen, it really requires some specific training in order to know how to deal with that. Any questions about lead? All right, radon. I've been dealing with radon a lot lately. I have a townhome that she listed with me, but prior to listing with me, they'd had 2 radon tests. Radon is a colorless, odorless, radioactive gas, bubbles up out of the stone, out of the ground, causes cancer. It's the second most common cause of lung cancer next to smoking. So she'd had 2 tests that showed it was under 4.0 picocuries per liter, which meant it was relatively safe. So we put it on the market. Within the first week, we had a buyer, full price offer, we went under contract. They did all their home inspections and so forth. The last thing was the radon inspection. And I said to her, you've had 2 tests previously and it came in low, we're probably fine. It came in at 10.3 picocuries per liter. So what happened? Well, we don't know for sure, but when we retested, it was still high. It was like 6 point something or 7 point something. And so it was a real mystery. Well, I started kind of researching this a little bit. It just so happens that this townhome is within a couple hundred feet of where they're building the northern loop. And they're pile driving there, putting in the stanchions to put the sound walls up, and you got big bulldozers and various things. And according to the radon experts, that kind of earth movement can actually shake up the ground underneath these townhomes and cause it to release more radon. Maybe it's temporary, we don't know. But in any case, we had to put in a remediation system to take care of it. So, first thing is, how do we find out what the levels of this is? Well, they make a couple of different systems for that. One of them is a passive device that you can buy at Lowe's or Home Depot. You stick it in your house. It's like a carbon filter that sucks in the gases, and over time it collects them, and then you send it off to a lab, and they'll tell you how much radon you have. The other is an active device that measures the amount of radon at any given moment. So both of these you would leave in the house for a couple of days at least to give it time to read, and then and determine how much radon. And the average needs to be less than 4.0 picocuries per liter. I've heard pluses and minuses for these at-home kits, but most people have said that they're just about as accurate as the active ones. These are a little more expensive, but of course most of your home inspectors will have the radon detectors that they can leave in the home for a couple of days to measure. Any of you sold a house that you had to have radon testing done yet. So at or above 4.0 picocuries per liter, is that a material fact? Yes, it is. Below that, it is not. Right? The mere presence of a radon reduction system is not a material fact. So if it's below 4.0 picocuries, it's not a material fact. In fact, it's pretty obvious though when you're walking around the house and you see this pipe sticking out of the side of the house. Basically, this is what they look like. You've got this going into the crawl space or under the house. If it's a slab, it goes underneath the slab actually. And it's sucking the air out from the under the house. This is a fan and it blows it out above the roof. And so by pulling the air out from underneath the house, you're keeping the radon gases from building up in the house. The most common places that I've seen this would be in a house that has a basement. And maybe the basement isn't that well ventilated, and so the gases tend to build up in the basement. And so it's a good idea to if you live in a house and you haven't had this radon testing, you might want to check it out. Again, it does cause a lung cancer. It takes, it takes a little long. It's like smoking. Sometimes people die after 30 years of smoking, right? But you never know. And the higher the levels, the more dangerous it is. Questions about that? Urea-Formaldehyde. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to have any urea in my house. But the fact is that they did building materials with this formaldehyde soaked materials, particle boards, plywood paneling, fiberboard. It was banned in 1982, and it causes respiratory problems. People have trouble breathing, skin irritations, and so forth. To be honest, I've never had to deal with this since I've been in business, but I know that there are problems. There were some problems with sheetrock. I think Chinese sheetrock that came in some years ago that had problems with this. But basically, if you've got materials that are made of this, sometimes you might have furniture that has problems with formaldehyde. This, of course, is the same stuff that we used to put our frogs in to keep them from deteriorating in the lab. So you don't really want to be breathing this stuff. Carbon monoxide. How many of you have a carbon monoxide detector in your house? I should see everybody's hand here. If you don't know whether you have a carbon monoxide detector, look around. The carbon monoxide detectors are really critical. If you have put in a new air conditioning system, they're required as part of the code to make sure that you have a carbon monoxide detector in the house. And it's basically colorless, odorless gas that's a product of burning natural gas, right? Or wood, or candles, right? Any of those things produce carbon monoxide. This came home to me when I had a routine check of my heating system a few years ago. And what they discovered was that the heat exchanger, which was sort of a wall between where the flames are and where the air is circulating through to the house, there's a heat exchanger, sort of a piece of, I don't know, metal or some ceramic or something, but it was cracked, which means it allowed gases to flow from where the burning fuel is into the house. We were very lucky that somebody discovered that before we had problems. But there's been several issues with people dying in the Triad area where carbon monoxide built up in the home, and basically carbon monoxide replaces the spaces where the oxygen connects to your blood, and so you suffocate. that you can just fall asleep and, you know, never wake up. So it's really, really critical that you make sure that you have that. If you have anything burning in your home, particularly heating systems, and, you know, people have kerosene, they have natural gas, they have oil, anything that's burning, if it leaks this carbon monoxide, you can have a real serious problem. So make sure you've got a carbon monoxide detector. Electromagnetic fields. If you've ever driven down the road and you saw those high voltage lines going through a neighborhood, they usually have a big space around them, so there's no homes right underneath them, but you can certainly have neighborhoods built right next to them. And I can tell you from experience that when you have buyers and they walk into the home and they go, oh, this is perfect, this is great. I love this house, love the layout, it's all, this would be a great place for the kids to play. Then they walk out the back door to the backyard and they look up and they see these high voltage lines going in the backyard, and they hear this. Even though the research hasn't definitively said that there's health problems with these high voltage lines, I can tell you that your real estate values are affected by those. And so you need to be aware of this. Make sure that if you're, you know, as you're driving through the neighborhood and you see those lines somewhere, they almost always converge on the house that you're going to show. I don't know what it is, but something, maybe that's because that house has been on the market for 6 months. And so just make sure that you're aware of that. And of course, if you're selling a house, you need to be upfront with the sellers and say, I know they're always going to say to you, well, we never even pay attention to those. You know, it doesn't bother us at all. And you're like, well, that's fine. And maybe there's some other people out there that won't bother, but a lot of people it is going to bother. And this is a numbers game, right? The more, the merrier. The more people you have looking at a house, the higher the price is likely to be. So if it limits the number of buyers that are willing to live there, it's going to affect your value. So make sure that you pay attention to that. So we've had a pretty good education in the last few weeks about water, right? And you know, effectively, we've talked about rain and the flooding of rivers and so forth. What I'd like to point out here, when we talk about groundwater, essentially the ground is soaked with water, but it doesn't usually reach the surface. The places where we see it reach the surface are low spots. Maybe we've got a little stream, or we've got a pond, or even a big lake, is a place where the groundwater is actually up above the surface. But most of the time, it's below the surface, but it's still there. And it's not like there's a giant hole. I used to think that groundwater was like a giant cave, you know, and you dig your well down until you punch through or something into this giant hole in the ground. But it's not like that at all. In fact, what it is most groundwater, you have the dirt, you have the sand and the clay and all of that mixed in, and there's little water particles in between all of that. So when you dig a well, you're basically digging into the ground to get below that water line where the water table is, and this is where you're going to get your water. So if it doesn't rain for a long time, this water table starts to go down. And in fact, you could have problems. We had a drought years ago where the water table just went way, way down, and people's wells dried up. They had to dig much farther in order to find that water. When we have lots of rain like we've had recently, the water table is very high, maybe even above the surface in the places where you live. So we've got some people down east that are really struggling right now because the ground is completely soaked with water. And the only place it has to go is in people's houses. So as an environmental risk, the problem here, of course, is that stuff gets into that groundwater. And there's been a lot of talk in the last couple of days about these coal ash pits and the poisons that are in those coal ash pits getting into the groundwater and also moving downstream, moving into areas where they're not supposed to be. You've got lots of different pollutants that can get into the groundwater. Other than coal ash, what are some other pollutants that you might find seeping or finding their way into the groundwater?
Manure.
Yeah.
Manure, yeah, the waste products of animals. You've got cattle or even just wild animals. It gets into streams and lakes and so forth, right? And then eventually seeps down into the water table. What else? What if you live near a farm, other than a cattle ranch? What if they're growing corn? What kind of problem might you have?
Pesticide.
What's it?
Pesticide.
Pesticides. Yeah, so treating to get rid of insects. What else might they be spraying on their plants? Fertilizer, right? To try to make sure they grow. Well, fertilizer, it would seem like would be a good thing, but you don't want to be drinking fertilizer, right? Not to mention the fact that it goes downstream and ends up into the ocean and fertilizes the ocean. We have a bunch of algae growing in the ocean, so that's not a good thing either. So all of these things can get into the contaminants. Certainly animal waste we talked about one-off, but also we have leaking tanks we'll talk about a little bit. And of course mining, if any of you live near a mine, near one of our open pit mines, things can seep into the water table close to that. And I just noticed we probably should take a little break now, so let's stop and get the restroom or whatever you need to do. We'll come back in 10 minutes.